Welcome everyone on this cold evening in New York. Thank you for coming out. I'm going to talk this evening about gluten-free sweets with a Japanese twist. And I want to pose this question for us to answer this evening. Gluten-free cookies with a Japanese twist, traditional Japanese desserts such as sakura mochi, batamuchi, namagashi, are gluten-free. And they're gluten-free because they are often made with rice flour and bean paste, which are naturally gluten-free ingredients. And my favorite, of course, is mochi stuffed with ice cream. And it's absolutely yummy, of course. These desserts are gluten-free and yummy, but are they good for you? Do we think that? We're not sure. So that is our question to answer this evening, both with my lecture and through Nicole's demonstration and our treats afterwards. What I'd like to cover tonight are starting out with the basics. What is gluten? What is gluten-free? Who should eat a gluten-free diet? Why should people eat a gluten-free diet? What are the current trends in the marketplace? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some baking tips and about myself. First, about demystifying gluten-free. Gluten is the protein element in wheat, rye, and barley. Gluten is the element that gives most baked goods elasticity, structure, and texture. Even ancient grains have gluten. Spelt is an ancient grain, kamut, farro, emmer. These all have gluten. They don't have as much gluten as wheat, rye, or barley. They are low in gluten, but they do have gluten. There are some no-gluten grains and flours, however. Rice flour, which I just mentioned, that's in my favorite Japanese treat, is gluten-free. There are other gluten-free grains as well: quinoa, teff, amaranth, tapioca, potato, which is not a grain but a vegetable, are also flours that are gluten-free. Cornmeal and oats is gluten-free, and then nut flours like hazelnut and almond are also gluten-free. If you follow a gluten-free diet, it's important that you do the following. You need to read labels. Labels are really very important because they will tell you if an ingredient has wheat, rye, or barley in it, or one of the derivatives of these gluten products. One of my favorite foods, you'll probably hear me say that a couple times tonight. I have a lot of favorite foods. One of my favorite foods, which is beer, has barley malt in it. So that contains gluten. So if you're following a gluten-free diet, you cannot drink beer. One of the other things that's important to learn from labels is the processing environment where food is manufactured. Sometimes grains are processed on the same equipment as wheat. So one grain that was often contaminated with wheat was oats. So many times people who are told to follow a gluten-free diet are told to avoid oats, even though it is naturally gluten-free, but it's processed on the same manufacturing equipment as wheat, and it could become contaminated with wheat powder and then have gluten in it. So it's very important to read labels. The key thing about labels is that there's often hidden gluten that you'll discover by reading labels. One of the interesting things to me as a baker is that chocolate in general is gluten-free. So I can make chocolate chip cookies that with semi-sweet chocolate or milk chocolate or dark chocolate, and the chocolate itself is gluten-free, except for white chocolate chips. White chocolate chips often have some wheat in them. Again, what's interesting as a baker is that white chocolate bars, like a baking bar of white chocolate, does not have any wheat product in it. So it's just the chips, the white chocolate chips, that actually have gluten in them. So again, reading labels is really important. Another product that has sometimes surprise gluten in it is almond paste. Almond paste is usually just made from almonds, which is a naturally gluten-free ingredient. It's ground almonds and sugar, but sometimes manufacturers put in some derivative of wheat, barley, or rye that makes it hold together a little bit better, and so therefore it would have gluten in it. Again, another favorite product of a food of mine is cheese, and almost all cheeses are gluten-free, except blue cheese sometimes has gluten in it. And the reason it has gluten is because the mold that manufacturers use to create the beautiful blue veins of blue cheese actually starts out being grown on some sort of bread. And so it has gluten in it. The last product up here that also could be a surprise that has gluten in it are artificial flavors. Artificial flavors often are manufactured in an environment that has some other liquids that run through it that might contain barley or rye, sometimes wheat. Artificial flavors almost always have some gluten in them. I avoid them mostly because of taste, but also because they have gluten in them. But if you have a pure extract, like pure vanilla or pure almond or pure peppermint extract, that's gluten-free. So it sounds a little bit tricky, and you become a detective if you need to follow a gluten-free lifestyle. You study labels in the aisle and look at the processing environment. One thing that you might want to do that if you ever wonder about a product is that you go to the manufacturer's website. Often they have Q&A about each product, and you can see if there's gluten in those products or not, or you can call their hotline as well. It's good to sort of constantly check products because manufacturers are always changing their formulas. Sometimes they will add some gluten derivative to their product to give it more elasticity. Sometimes they'll actually remove the gluten-free product, the gluten product out of it so it becomes gluten-free. So that's a little bit about what gluten is and what makes things gluten-free. I want to spend a little bit of time, though, talking about gluten-free lifestyles. So there are many people today that feel it's important to follow a gluten-free diet. And who are those people, and is it important? This is one of my favorite cartoons. I don't know if you can read it, so I'll read it to you. It says, "I have no idea what gluten is either, but I'm avoiding it just to be safe." Many people do that. They're not sure what this gluten thing is. Should I be gluten-free? All my friends are gluten-free. And so they decide that they're going to follow a gluten-free diet, and they're not even really sure what it is. And it sort of becomes a fad in that way, not really something that has real understanding and a real choice for them. But there are people who must be gluten-free. And I want to talk about who those people are and why it's really important for those people. People who must eat gluten-free fall into three main categories. The first are people that have celiac disease. So celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder, and it's triggered by gluten. People have a genetic predisposition, and sometimes they have an event that triggers the actual onset of this condition. The only way that celiac disease can be managed is through diet. There are no drugs out there that people who have celiac disease can take that help the symptoms. So they have to eat a completely gluten-free diet, which is often very difficult. The second group that needs to eat gluten-free are people that have gluten sensitivity. So people with gluten sensitivity have very similar symptoms to people who have celiac disease. Some of those symptoms are stomach cramps and diarrhea, maybe feeling lethargic after eating a lot of bread or pasta or drinking a lot of beer. It's not life-threatening, unlike celiac disease, but it has very similar symptoms and people feel uncomfortable. And the third group that needs to eat gluten-free and must eat gluten-free are people that have wheat allergies. So people that have wheat allergies have an anaphylactic reaction, just as other people with other allergies have, and it's potentially life-threatening to them because they are allergic to it. There are about 22 million people in the United States right now that fit these categories. About 1% of the population has been diagnosed with celiac disease. About 6% have been diagnosed with gluten sensitivity, and about less than 1% have been diagnosed with wheat allergies. So in general, it's about 22 million people. There are a lot of people out there self-diagnosed at the moment. Those people probably double these numbers, but these numbers come from authorities like the National Institute of Health, the Mayo Clinic, and the Center for Celiac Disease. So these are the accepted numbers. Some people, however, choose to eat gluten-free, and I think that makes up the majority of people right now eating gluten-free. People say that they feel better when they choose a gluten-free diet. They have more energy. Some people like it because it helps them focus on their diet better, and they lose weight as a result of that. There are even some doctors who might recommend it to people who have arthritis or people who have some mental functioning problems. I have a nephew who has autism, and his doctor has recommended that he follow a gluten-free diet. I have a girlfriend who has an acid reflux condition, and her doctor is recommending that she follow a gluten-free diet. So doctors are feeling there are some health benefits to it. People do feel better. And I believe if people feel better, they should eat the way that makes them feel best. However, there is some controversy out there regarding the health benefits of living a gluten-free diet. Gluten, as I said, is a protein, so it has certain minerals and nutrients in it that are important. It also has fiber. And so if you take gluten out of your diet, you're eliminating fiber, you're eliminating vitamin B, calcium, iron, and some other nutrients. So you need to substitute for that. So you need to probably take some nutritional supplements. Gluten-free products sometimes do not taste very good, and so manufacturers add extra sugar and extra fat to the products to actually give them more flavor. So there is a lot of controversy about this. If you go online, you'll see there are many dietitians that do not recommend that people follow a gluten-free diet in general, unless they absolutely need to for medical purposes. What do I think? I'm a baker. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a dietitian. I believe, as I said, you should do what makes you feel good. You should eat the things that make you feel best and make you feel happy and energetic. So I think for myself and for others that people should probably limit the intake of refined flours that they have, and that you should eat more vegetables. My mom said that when I was a child. It's still true. You get a lot of protein from vegetables. I also believe that you should examine your nutritional intake, and you should consult a nutritionist or a dietitian if you decide to adopt a gluten-free lifestyle, because you need to substitute for some of the things that you might find in gluten. So that's a little bit about what is gluten-free, who should do it, why should you do it. I also want to cover a little bit about the gluten-free marketplace, because this is an area of packaged goods that has exploded in the last few years. It's driven by people and more diagnosis of the diseases that I mentioned, specifically celiac and gluten sensitivity, but it's also driven by the people who've decided to adopt a gluten-free lifestyle. These are the trends in sales. This comes from Source Package Facts that was last published in October of 2012. This was what they were saying between 2008 and 2012. Packaged goods gluten-free product sales grew about 40%, from $3 billion to $4.2 billion, and they were forecasting a 60% increase in sales from 2012 to 2017. So in less than 10 years, the forecast was to more than double in sales of gluten-free products. It's a pretty amazing marketplace. And as I said, a lot of it is being driven by people who have decided to adopt a gluten-free lifestyle and don't need to do so for medical reasons. The fastest growing categories are snacks, cereals, frozen meals, and baked goods. The kinds of manufacturers that are actually fueling this growth come from about 3 different sources. The first source for gluten-free product sales is actually manufacturers who have a naturally gluten-free product. Another favorite food of mine, potato chips made from potato salt, oil, is naturally gluten-free. So you will see now, if you don't eat potato chips, go take a look in the aisle. You will notice most of them now say they're gluten-free. They were always gluten-free. So a lot of manufacturers are simply putting gluten-free on their packaging. So that's one source of more sales. The second source of sales are manufacturers who have a product line where it's easy to adopt that product to gluten-free. So Rice Chex, which is up here as the example for cold cereal, Rice Chex is made with rice, gluten-free product, but it had malt in it. They've removed the malt from that processing, and now it's very easy for them to have a manufactured product that does not contain gluten. The third area are really new entrants to the marketplace. Those entrants are specific companies entering with just gluten-free products. So the other 2 examples up here, Amy's and Udi's, are new entrants into the packaged goods arena whose product lines are only gluten-free. So that's sort of the manufacturing situation. The food growth has created a very competitive environment, and it's a little bit cluttered. And as I described earlier, right now you can only learn about what's gluten-free by what manufacturers tell you and what's on the label. So it's a little bit competitive out there and sometimes confusing for consumers. There is help, though, on the horizon. Earlier this year in August, the Food and Drug Administration issued an announcement defining gluten. And so this is actually setting a standard for gluten-free products. So the standard that they established back in August was under 20 parts per million of gluten. And this applies to all foods that are labeled gluten-free, no gluten, free of gluten, made without gluten. And anybody who manufactures products by August of 2014 will need to have their products tested so that they can certify them as having less than 20 parts per million. So all of that, reading labels that you have to do between now and August 2014 will still happen, but after 2014 August, you will be able to see on a product that it's now certified as gluten-free. So it will simplify choices that people have to make. It makes the requirements much more stringent. Even things that are manufactured in an environment that processes wheat can become certified as gluten-free if they meet the requirements of less than 20 parts per million. So this is a great benefit to consumers. So now let's talk about me. So how did I get into this gluten-free baking thing anyway? It was a long time ago. It was almost 20 years ago, in fact. In 1995, about this time of year, I gave to my boss a beautiful tin of holiday cookies. So in the introduction, you heard I've been baking cookies my whole life since I was 9 years old, and at holiday time, I always make cookies for friends and family and for colleagues at work. So I brought my boss this beautiful tin of cookies. And after a couple days, I noticed it was still sitting on her desk. She hadn't opened it, she hadn't taken it home, and I was a little upset about it. So I asked her, what's up, why didn't you take the cookies home? And she told me that her 2 sons, who at that time were 4 and 7 both had celiac disease. They had been diagnosed with that, and her life was a nightmare. She couldn't make pizza for them. She couldn't give them muffins. They couldn't go to McDonald's. They couldn't go to kids' parties. They had to eat this gluten-free diet, and it was really complicated and really hard. And this was 1995. So by the end of the conversation with my friend Kathy, she said, "Oh, you're such a good cookie baker. Can you bake for my sons?" And I was like, "I don't really know, but I'm up for the challenge." And so between Christmas and New Year's that year, I made 3 recipes for her sons that were gluten-free, had chocolate chips. I did a lot of research, even though the internet was pretty nascent at that time, and I could find out what was gluten-free and what was not. So that's how I got started. And over the years, I've saved a lot of recipes, and I always noted when they were gluten-free or not gluten-free. As a result of that effort, in 2011, I wrote a book called Gluten-Free Cookies that has about 50 recipes in it. My recipes have a couple of different approaches that I'll touch on in a minute in terms of what makes them gluten-free. But basically, rice flour is one of the key ingredients in it that I use, and also almond flour. I just published a second book called Sassy Cookies. I'm a cookie baker probably first and a gluten-free cookie baker second. In my Sassy Cookies book, there are 8 gluten-free recipes as well. What I discovered in writing these books and in researching about baking cookies that are gluten-free is that many baking ingredients are naturally gluten-free. Baking powder, baking soda, eggs, butter, sugar, spices, extracts, chocolate, most chocolate, already gluten-free. So the thing that I had to do in writing my recipes was really substitute mostly for the flour. My flour substitute is very similar to many manufacturers of gluten-free products. It's a combination of brown rice flour, potato starch, tapioca starch, and I add almond flour to add extra nutrients and a little extra fat. There's also an ingredient called xanthan gum, which helps the products with texture, elasticity, and crumb. So xanthan gum is not a bad thing. It sounds a little funny, probably needs some rebranding. But it's actually a natural ingredient, and it's what makes those other flours stick together. I also use a lot of nut flours in my recipe. My own heritage is from Europe. My grandmother was from Sweden. They baked with a lot of almond flour, hazelnut flour, so I use that in my recipes as well. I also use nut butters, and then I just use egg whites. Meringues have, sugar and eggs. That's gluten-free. May not be healthy because there's a lot of sugar, but it is gluten-free as well. If you plan to make recipes, I strongly advise you to check out what's in the recipe and always add xanthan gum. It's easy to convert a recipe. Actually, in the book that I have here tonight with me for the Gluten-Free Cookies book, there's a conversion chart in it. And you need to always add that mysterious xanthan gum to things to give it texture and crumb. The other tip I can give you for baking is that for me anyway, chilling the rice flour dough makes it a lot easier to handle. Rice flour is a very sticky ingredient, and by chilling it, it's just easier to manage it in the process. So that's one of the tips that I have for people. So I think I've set us up to start to answer the question, are Japanese desserts not just gluten-free and yummy, but are they good for you? And now I'm going to ask Nicole to come up and give us a great demo. Thank you all.
It is a pleasure to be here tonight. I've had a pretty long history with the Japan Society. My company, Kyotofu, has been catering events here for probably about 8 years, and this is the first time I've been up here on the stage. Just to tell you a little bit about me, I studied Japanese and business undergrad at Georgetown University, and then I won a Monbusho scholarship, and I studied at Jochi, or Sophia University in Japan. I was studying kind of Japanese business practices and learning about Japanese business, but I fell in love with Japanese food. And that was pretty much all I did for my 2 years when I was in Japan was eat. And came back and I worked at a bank for a little while, and then I said, you know what, I want to go back to my first love, which is really Japanese food. And what got me is that Japanese do a really great job at desserts. Not super sweet, very true to the flavors. You can always taste the flavor as it's supposed to be. And so about 8 or 9 years ago, I decided, okay, I want to bring Japanese style of desserts to New York and show people what Japanese desserts are really all about. And I kind of stumbled upon this gluten-free thing by accident because you guys know Yokan, Anmitsu, they're just naturally gluten-free. And so I started using rice flour and baking, and we kind of stumbled upon, okay, we can make a gluten-free matcha cupcake. We can make a gluten-free miso brownie, and it's really good using rice flour. So I am going to demo 3 recipes for you guys today. One, and then you guys are going to taste them afterwards too. And one is miso brownie using marukome miso, white miso. Another one is yuzu muffin using yuzu juice. Let's see, yeah, there we go. Using yuzu juice from Hokkaido. And then my personal favorite, we're gonna do a matcha muffin or matcha cupcake using actually Itoen beautiful matcha. So I think I'm gonna start with the matcha. So the first thing we do is, first of all, this is called a double boiler. I don't know how many of you guys have used a double boiler before, but it's basically a pot filled with water. The water is boiling, and then there's a bowl over it where you put your ingredients in, starting with chocolate. So this is how we are going to melt the chocolate down. And this basically prevents the chocolate from burning. So I use these nice chocolate little pellets here that melt super quickly because of their shape. And of course, to the chocolate, we have to add butter. And I love Japanese cuisine because Japanese cuisine is all about all food in moderation. It's not about completely omitting fat from your diet, completely omitting sugar from your diet. It's about saying, you know what, every food has its good points and its bad points, and we should eat everything in moderation. So we're just gonna, let's see, can you guys see this? So we're just gonna melt down the chocolate and the butter in this double boiler. Maybe a little more chocolate. And you'll see once if your double boiler is hot, these things melt really pretty fast. And while that's melting, let's just take again another look at this beautiful matcha. Can you guys all see this? How beautiful and green this is? And I'm sure all of the Japanese people in our audience know this, but for those of you who don't, this is a completely natural color. There is nothing artificial about this beautiful bright green color. And this is achieved by the green tea leaves. Oh, thank you. Green tea leaves growing in the shade. The green tea leaves are grown in the shade so that all of the wonderful amino acids can kind of build up, and then they are picked. And the kind of rough parts of the green tea leaf, the stems and whatnot, are usually hand-picked out, and what's left is ground up in a very slow process, in usually a stone grinder, and that's what becomes matcha. And matcha is traditionally used in the Japanese tea ceremony, which I'm sure a lot of you know whisked up and used in the Japanese tea ceremony. But it's kind of getting worldwide attention just as a for all of its wonderful health benefits, antioxidants and amino acids, and also people really enjoy the flavor. So you guys are going to try our gluten-free green tea muffins. So we're almost here on our wet ingredients. Usually when you make one of these recipes, you want to combine your wets and your dries separately. I have already pre-combined the dries just to speed this process along, but the dries here, the dries here are our own proprietary blend of gluten-free flour, which is white rice flour, brown rice flour, tapioca starch, potato flour, a little cornstarch, and a little xanthan gum, which Luann was talking about. I also have a little bit of baking powder and some 10x sugar in here. So we'll just throw that in a bowl here. And we're gonna, and the great thing about matcha too is that a little bit goes a long way. I put actually quite a lot in this container just so you guys could see the bright green color, but yeah, you actually hardly need any in a recipe to give it both flavor and color because it's so amazingly potent. So we'll just blend that the matcha in. To our dries. And we're almost there on our wets. And again, the reason we use the double boiler here is so as not to burn the chocolate. So when you reach this consistency here, you can take it off the double boiler. I'm actually going to get another double boiler going for our next recipe. And we just add it to our dries little by little. And then, last but not least, are our eggs. I usually just want to incorporate those one by one. you guys kind of get the idea. You end up with a very green, beautiful batter that you can then pipe into muffin cups, pound cake cups, basically any kind of mold you want to bake this in. It's a very easy to use batter. And one more. So again, this is pretty close to the finished green tea muffin batter, which you guys are going to try the green tea muffins when we break, but you can see that beautiful bright green color. So let's move on to our yuzu muffins. How many of you are familiar with yuzu? You guys know what yuzu is? So yuzu is this amazing Japanese citrus, and it only really grows properly in Japan. They've tried to grow it in California, and I've tasted yuzu grown in California, and it just does not taste the same. And for those of you who haven't had it before, it's kind of, it has kind of a grapefruity taste, a lemony taste, and it's just really special. I'll pour some of this out here. And I import it from Hokkaido in these nice big kind of sake bottles. I'll show you guys what it looks like when I pour it out. And I find it's just wonderful in baked goods. But if you guys can see it, oh, I wish you could smell it. Oh, it's beautiful. If you guys can see it, this is yuzu juice, and it's great in recipes. Anywhere you would use lemon, it's great in cocktails. It has this very kind of fragrant aroma. It's just magical. So I like to use it in cupcakes, muffins, and pound cakes. Again, places where you would typically use lemon. So again, we are going to start with our white chocolate. White chocolate is the basis of many of my muffin recipes because it kind of adds moisture and it extends the shelf life using a nice, very high quality white chocolate. And again, butter. Melt that all down on our double boiler. And we're going to add our yuzu juice. Wow. And when we're making this in the kitchen, it's just, oh my gosh, the whole 12,000 square foot kitchen just smells of yuzu. It's wonderful. Again, I already prepped out our dries, so our gluten-free flour with the brown rice flour or white rice flour, potato, tapioca, a little baking soda, our sugars, and a little salt. So put that in a bowl. And just a tip, if you guys are ever melting butter or melting chocolate, you want to get everything into as small chunks as possible, because the smaller the chunks, the faster things melt. Similarly, the smaller the quantities, the faster things cool too. Can you guys smell this at all? You smell the yuzu? Isn't that great? So during my time in Japan, I spent a lot of time with family-owned businesses. I had friends who were, fifth generation, seventh generation, eighth generation family business food and sake producers, and I was just struck by how passionate people were and what pride people took in really creating a high quality food product. And I was telling Sakurai-san before we came down here, the level of kind of Japanese ingredients is just, it's up here. It's beyond what the rest of the world is producing, really. So we're pretty close here. So I'm going to start adding our wets again to our dries, little by little. And you'll see all of these recipes are pretty simple. And again, add eggs one by one. And the reason you want to add the eggs one by one and incorporate them slowly is because you don't want the eggs to cook. And I'm probably going to stop here, but you guys kind of get the idea of what the batter looks like. And then you're going to taste it in just a few minutes. And one last item I want to make for you guys is our chocolate miso brownie. So this is not something super traditionally Japanese, but I love miso. I think miso is one of the most versatile Japanese ingredients. I mean, it has this kind of buttery, salty, savory taste to it, and I just love the way it tastes in brownies. So we put shiro miso in our brownies, and I think it really balances out the sweetness of a brownie, and it also imparts this kind of little bit of umami flavor to the brownie as well. So again, you guys are gonna probably get tired of this, but we're gonna start with chocolate in the double boiler. And this time we're using 65% dark chocolate. So the last two recipes we used white chocolate. Now we're using 64% dark chocolate. And again, butter. And what's different now is to the butter and chocolate, we are going to add miso. And with miso, whether you're using it as a marinade or an ingredient, a little bit goes a long way. So we're just going to give a little bit. Because miso is very potent. And for those of you who don't know what miso is, it's fermented soybeans. And the color of the miso will tell you how long the soybeans have fermented. So there's anything from a white miso, which is the kind of youngest of the misos, all the way to a red miso, which is older and darker and kind of has a deeper flavor. So we let the butter and the chocolate and the miso all kind of melt together. All those nice flavors. And again, I've pre-done our dries, which consists of the gluten-free flour, sugar, baking powder. So you see, if you have your double boiler rolling, the chocolate melts pretty fast. And then to this recipe, as well as actually the yuzu muffin, I like to add a little bit of vanilla paste as well. I find it adds a nice aspect to the muffin or the cupcake. And I particularly like Nielsen Massey vanilla. So I'll typically just add a little spot to my wets. So vanilla paste is basically extract with ground up beans. And to my dries, I am going to add some very nice, rich cocoa powder. So this is gonna be like a super, you guys will see when you taste, it's like super chocolatey. So again, just like everything else, we're just gonna add it little by little. And your brownie batter should be kind of a little more wet than your muffin batters. Because your muffin batters you could maybe scoop, and your brownie batter usually my brownie batter you're gonna pipe. Oh, now it's starting to look like brownie batter. And what makes these brownies a little special besides the miso is that we actually use melted chocolate rather than just cocoa powder. If you buy, brownie mix in the stores, those will typically just have cocoa powder in them, but we actually melt chocolate down, high quality chocolate. And then again, we're gonna add our eggs one by one. Can you smell the chocolate? And now we're getting closer to kind of brownie batter consistency. And this is kind of what the brownie batter should look like. And I'll show you guys what the finished products look like. So here's our chocolate souffle muffin. So this is what it looks like. And our matcha muffin. And I want you guys to see how green it is in the middle. It's beautiful, right? Well, often when I give samples out and when I demo at Whole Foods, people who don't know about matcha will often ask me if this is from food coloring. And I'll say, no, this is the natural color of matcha. And then last but not least, our yuzu blueberry muffin. And again, you can kind of see nice yuzu color, yuzu smell. And after the Q&A, you guys are going to try all of these things. So I think we're ready to move on to the Q&A. After I clean up my messy kitchen here.
It smells really good up here.
Ask us questions about Japanese desserts, gluten-free desserts,
Baking.
baking.
I was wondering why tapioca starch is used so frequently in gluten-free mixtures. Some of us have problems with tapioca as well.
It's one of the ingredients that substitutes for the wheat flour. So it has some properties of stickiness, basically, that add to the flour mixture. I think there are some substitutes that you can use for tapioca if you have allergies to it. I think off the top of my head, Cornstarch, I think, is one of the substitutes for it.
I mean, we've tried omitting the tapioca starch in our gluten-free flour recipe, and for whatever reason, it just doesn't come out the same.
Yeah, I would agree. I've tried different variations of flour mixtures as well, and it doesn't come out the same. Potato starch is another one that's a little unusual. You can't use potato flour. That's actually something different than potato starch. Potato starch is from raw potatoes, and potato flour is from cooked potatoes. So if you go shopping for one of those ingredients, be sure you use potato starch.
One is going to absorb water, and one is not going to.
I had a question about the miso. I find it's a pretty cool idea to use it in baking, but I've never tried it. What kind of other recipes would you try?
Oh my
Just to give me an
gosh.
idea.
Oh
And
my
also,
gosh.
would you give us a hint on what quantity to try out versus like the ratio of
Well,
miso to
remember-
chocolate or something?
Remember, miso is really, really potent. It's fermented, so it's really, really salty. So you kind of want to, use it sparingly. But miso is such a versatile ingredient. Like I was saying, you can use it as a marinade. You can use it. A lot of times we've done miso caramels. You know, salted caramel is a popular flavor. You can use miso in place, and I always find that miso lends kind of buttery, savory flavor that plain salt just doesn't, and goes well with any kind of chocolate. I think miso is my favorite ingredient, hands down. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe anytime you want to use salted butter, you could just take the salt out of the butter and try miso instead?
You definitely could, absolutely. Any place where you use salt, miso is going to add a dimension that plain salt wouldn't typically add. So again, like you said, you could use unsalted butter and then put in, a little bit of miso. And like I said, you want to use it very sparingly because it's very strong. The salty flavor is very strong, so you want to use it sparingly.
Yes, in the center. Could you wait for the mic, please?
I can actually do no mic, I'm good. Thank you.
No, we'd like you to use the mic because we're recording.
So what about semi-sweet or savory things? Like, for example, croissant or like pizza? Do you have any thoughts or favorite recipes, gluten-free or with a Japanese twist?
I love matcha in everything. So that's my Japanese weakness. I have a favorite French macaron that is made with green tea and a little almond cream for its filling. So that's my actual favorite. I find gluten-free pasta and gluten-free pizzas almost impossible to make, but I probably haven't practiced enough. Do you have a favorite?
Are you specifically asking about gluten-free things or savory things incorporating Japanese ingredients?
I mean, two birds, one stone would be great, but anything you have to share would be nice to know.
I don't know if probably several people in the audience have had things like pizza in Japan, and I love eating foreign food in Japan because Japanese kind of take a foreign food and make it their own. So you'll have pizza with corn on it and potatoes and barbecue sauce and seafood, squid. But I think the kind of overarching element is that Japanese are really good at balance when it comes to cuisine. And so, whereas Americans tend to go overboard in one direction or the other, Japanese will say, okay, I'm going to have pizza, but let's add a little carbs to it. Let's add a little protein to it, and just kind of like round it out.
Thank you very much.
You should try Domino's in Japan. It's very interesting.
Sounds awesome.
I think savory foods are really interesting. My new cookbook, Sassy Cookies, that just came out is mostly savory and some exotic mixtures of chocolate and spices. I find it really fun, and I haven't tried miso, but after seeing this demo, I definitely have to try it. Any other questions? Yes, in the front.
Do you use exact measurements or weights when you make these?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't today just because we were demoing for you guys, but I'm sure Luann can attest, so they say savory cooking is an art and baking is a science. So if you're off just by the smallest little bit on an ingredient, your whole recipe will be off. It won't bake up correctly or it'll fall flat. So we are exact to the gram when even when we make huge big batches of these things in my kitchen, we are exact to the gram.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think that baking is like culinary science, or culinary chemistry. It's so exact. And measuring for gluten-free, I think, puts a lot of pressure on it. You need to be more exact because it's sort of the relationships of the different flours that make it all work. And so you really have to be very precise. Many of you in the audience are Americans, and many of you are not. And I think Americans tend to use measures like cups and spoons and tablespoons. And I think other cultures tend to use scales. And scales are much more accurate, and it's actually much easier to prepare anything if you scale it rather than measure it in a cup or a tablespoon.
I'll give you a great example. So we would make our green tea muffins in these kind of big batches, and we would put them into piping bags and then pipe them out and bake them in the oven. And we were noticing that like 2 piping bags out of the 8 piping bags that we would make in a batch wouldn't bake up properly. They would fall flat. So come to find out that the mixer wasn't getting to the very bottom of the mixing bowl and fully incorporating what was on the bottom. So the last 2 piping bags didn't bake properly because they weren't fully incorporated. So baking you have to be really, really precise.
Okay, I think that's our last question. Thank you all very much for coming.
I can't wait for you guys to taste everything.